you no longer see yourself as being connected to anything. Like, you don't have a connection to yourself, you don't have a connection to your community, to your family, you don't have a connection to like God or a higher purpose or higher power. You are connectionless. You're just sort of like drifting away, and you don't matter to anyone or anything, and there's no purpose, and there's no way out, and there's no way back, and there's no reason to look for a way back to joy or happiness or connection, because and this is sort of the logic, right, of the sort of the depression mind, the suicide mind. The only thing that makes sense is you have to die.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Welcome back, humans of the internet who are listening to my voice through some sort of internet plastic and metal device. With resources extracted unsustainably from labor that is heavily exploited, most likely in the global south. My name is Max Golding. I am one of two parts of a podcast called, what are we called again? It's Not Just in Your Head. We're two therapists. The other half is Harriet Fraud. You may have just heard a car drive by because, like last week, I'm doing a solo episode inside of my car at night because I don't want to keep my housemates up. Normally I record in the morning with Harriet when my housemates are kind of bustling around, and it's a little bit less weird to be recording. So sorry if you're hearing car noises or whatever, but it's quite nice out in my car with the cool breeze, with the window open. In any case, another solo episode by myself. Last week I did one on how to form a tenants union, and actually, as a piggyback off of that, I really hope that at least one listener listening actually considered trying to form a tenants union. Because when I talk about stuff like that, I really do not give a shit about whether or not you think that I am cool or interesting or smart or informed or experienced or a leader or anything good. I actually would much prefer for you to not attribute any positive quality to me as a messenger delivering information to you when I'm talking about the topic of organizing. And I would much rather you try to integrate and embody that information and actually use it to take action, because that information is information that I learned from other people, and then I started to sort of embody and use, and it's improved my life and other people's lives. And the point is not to sort of view this as entertainment or to prop up personalities and characters in your life, and especially through these weird parasocial relationships we have with each other online, right? Where, like, so since you discovered me through a podcast, you might think like, oh, there's something interesting or special about this person, but I'm just sort of like temporarily alive, like slowly decaying flesh like you know what I mean? I just happen to be like entering your ears through a thing called a podcast on the internet. So, like, actually organize tenants, actually form a tenants union. Okay, anyway. Harriet's not here. She wasn't here last week. She's not here this week. This is very temporary. The podcast is not becoming like the Max show at all, I promise. Harriet will be back next week. We're going to record a great episode together with somebody else. It's going to be great. So why the topic of suicide? Well, the funny story behind this, before I get into like the depressing part of it, is I emailed Harriet a couple nights ago asking if she thought we should skip for the week or if I should do a solo episode while she's gone. She said, well, go ahead and do a solo episode if you want. I said, okay, well, I'll do a solo episode. Two topics that are kind of floating around my head right now are Jordan Peterson and suicide. Two very unrelated topics. And she said, literally, I think suicide would be great. Suicide would be great. Like, I saw that text and I thought, oh God. Well, suicide's not great, but yeah, it's a great topic. So why suicide? Sometimes with this podcast, this is like episode 14, I think. Sometimes I think we've moved out of our scope, and we just talk about left-wing stuff a lot, and sometimes I forget, even if I'm listening, like as I'm editing the recordings and stuff, like we don't really sound like therapists a lot of the time. We just sound like left-wing wannabe pundits or something. And like, we should probably talk about mental health more. And I guess the issue is the mainstream and medical and sort of neoliberal zeitgeist about mental health is that mental health is to be confined into areas of intellectual exploration and parts of society that actually don't have to do with society or politics or economics. It really has to do with like the human mind, which at best you can kind of say is philosophy, but most of the time it's more like it's psychological sciences, which are supposed to be rooted at this point in like, you know, the hardest science possible is like brain science or like neurobiology, and then the softer psychological science stuff you have to kind of stick to like psychological academic research or something like that, and basically anything outside of that is like not mental health. But suicide is, I mean, quite obviously a mental health issue, and it's something we haven't talked about a whole lot. I think we covered a couple of statistics a while back on things like, for example, this is a more recent study, but suicide rates are higher in areas with lower minimum wage. That one study sent out a flurry of media headlines that were saying, want to reduce suicide rates, raise minimum wage. I was thinking from a sort of journalistic or even marketing perspective, like those are great headlines. And I actually like half agree with that. Like, yeah, okay, to reduce suicide rates, let's raise minimum wage. So I think we spoke on that a little bit before, and since I've brought it up, I'll continue down this line of discussion. So with the question of, well, why would suicide rates be higher? If this is true, right? Assuming it's true, the research is accurate. Why would rates be higher where there is more poverty? And part of that seems probably intuitive to most people, right? Well, if your financial stress is so great that you don't really see a way out, then maybe it makes sense to start thinking about killing yourself, and maybe you'll actually do it. But I think there's something deeper there. So what is minimum wage? Minimum wage is the lowest allowable amount of money per hour that an employer can give a worker in exchange for the labor they're providing for that employer. And what's that employer's goal? That employer's goal is to make profit. And this applies to like small mom and pop restaurants and, I don't know, computer repair shops and mechanic shops. I mean, every small business operates on this profit motive, which says that you have to pay your workers under a certain amount or otherwise you can't make profit. Large corporations operate on the same principle to the extent that they will try to minimize labor costs both domestically and internationally if they are capable of creating a kind of international workforce, if they're like a multinational corporation. If suicide rates are higher in areas with lower minimum wages, or where, you know, wages are lower in general, the easy way to kind of talk about this is to say, well, yeah, because there's a higher likelihood for people who are making less money to be compounded with so many more stressors. I can't pay for gas in my car. I can't pay off my credit card debt. I can't pay, let's say, maybe my student loan debt if I went to college. Having trouble making rent. Okay, now I'm having to live in my car for a time. If you're single, like, okay, I'm so poor, like, no one will like me because, like, I'm not wearing the nicest clothes. I can't afford nice clothes. So there's just kind of, we could make up infinite stories here about what happens when you're not making enough money, that then contributes to this this burden of extreme stress, this negative self-concept, a negative sense of self and identity, where you find it very difficult to see yourself as a whole and valuable and purposeful human being. And as all these factors compound and get worse over time, the idea of suicide pops in your head. And so I've mentioned this before, but dialectical behavioral therapy, or I'll call it DBT from here forward, is the so-called modality of psychotherapy that I'm most trained in. And DBT was designed specifically, well, not exactly as a suicide prevention treatment. And the creator of the modality, Marcia Linehan, is really adamant about that. She says this is not a suicide prevention program. It's a program that helps people build a life worth living. There's a lot of evidence behind DBT being effective. I'm really not going to give a sales pitch for DBT. I'm not a religious zealot about it, although I do. I like DBT a lot. But from a DBT framework, we tend to talk about suicidality as an issue of, it's usually like kind of a multi-problem issue. Like people who are suicidal tend not to just have like one problem going on in their life. There's usually a lot going on in their life. But the central cause, quote unquote, I'd say there's causes, but if you could pin down one, it has to do with really extreme emotion dysregulation, which just means like like feeling really intense and extreme emotions like really suddenly and really intensely in a way that kind of like knocks your reasoning off course for as long as those emotions are in that extreme intensity. Coupled usually with all kinds of situational factors, like you got dumped, you got fired, you got, whatever, like you got accused of doing something really bad or whatever. And like, so, and then usually the primary emotion, as we call it, would be shame. There's usually other factors as well, but like really, really intense shame. The intensity hits you so hard and so fast, and it lasts for so long that you make an impulsive decision to kill yourself. And then you do it. So women have much higher rates of suicide attempts. Men have much higher rates of completion of suicide. Completion is it's almost like a PC term for like you killed yourself. If you completed a suicide, you killed yourself. I think that there's a sort of carefulness around, there's caution, no, carefulness is not a word. There's caution around, I think, saying like successfully committing suicide. You succeeded, you killed yourself. So from like a sort of DBT and like maybe like an emotion and like psychological, theoretical perspective, it's like, well, people kill themselves when they get really emotionally dysregulated, which is related to like feeling overwhelmed by stress and all these situational factors. Okay, so like not having enough money is obviously like going to be a pretty big compounding factor in like making all your stressors more difficult to cope with. But there's this paradox. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's basically like this black-white. It's a racial paradox. White men have the highest rates. Well, I think white men and Native American men are like really similar in rates, but I think white men are like maybe slightly. But just for the sake of argument, white men have the highest rates of suicide completion, and black women actually have the lowest. And if you think about the economics of this is actually a contradiction, I think, in maybe some of Harriet and my own, the stuff we harp on, which some people maybe would call class reductionist or something, is that, I mean, if you randomly select a white man and you randomly select a black woman, you're probably going to find less economic and financial security and prosperity in a black woman and more in a white man. And well, maybe that's not completely true though at the same time. But okay, again, just for the sake of argument, let's go down this rabbit hole. So, if that's true, you that kind of confuses the issue, right? Like, and this has been discussed in like psychology and sociology in the literature. No, there's not a ton of attention to this, and I think there's probably some fear within academia of going down this rabbit hole too far. But like, what exactly are the protective factors for black women in particular? If black women are like, from sort of intersectionality theory, you'd say like, well, black women are some of the most like oppressed, like one of the most oppressed like demographic groups in America. Um, like, why wouldn't their suicide rates be higher? And if white men are, again, from sort of intersectional theory, from a sort of identity politic, arguably sort of neoliberal identity politic point of view, you'd be like, well, white men have it all, man. So why are the rates higher? I recall years ago, I don't remember if it was an actual talk, because I did see Tim Wise live one time, but maybe it was a talk I was watching on YouTube. But Tim Wise, who's like one of those like anti-racist diversity training, like, he has like a fancy website and he sells 1 million books every year and stuff, just like Robin DiAngelo. And Tim Wise's thing is like, well, white men seeing the world around them become less white men centric is making them feel as though they are becoming more oppressed, and this is causing it's causing distress on a level that's so extreme for them, they can't handle that like diversity is happening, and so they are killing themselves in like disproportionate rates. That's the sort of Tim Wise, I think, sort of like very privileged, heavy explanation for that. I'm not sure what the Tim Wise crowd would say about like black women having a lower rate. I just found a sociology article earlier that had kind of two relatively contradicting points on this, and one was that I don't want to say prevailing theory, because I don't think it's discussed enough in academia, but one big theory has to do with social connections for black women, that black women are more likely to be connected to a church and a close-knit social group than, for example, white males. And so this social connectivity, and I would say, like, so from Harriet's like what did she say in like the first episode? And she says this all the time, and I've actually stolen this a couple times in talking to clients as if it's like my idea, which is kind of ingenuous. But the mental health is like 4 sturdy legs of a table, right? You got like your like personal like purpose and like cause. You have like immediate friends and like social connections. You have like this sort of larger social connection type stuff, and then I don't even remember what the fourth one was, or if I'm saying them incorrectly. But when Harriet describes this, she's saying essentially that connectivity to self, to others, to a sort of purpose beyond yourself, these are the foundations of good mental health. I completely agree with this, and I think from this sort of social connectivity perspective, what this is essentially saying is that white males, middle-aged white males who are like killing themselves in like really high disproportionate rates, are far lonelier and more disconnected than most other slices of the demographic pie, and black women just happen to be like more highly connected. And I actually recall when I was in undergrad, I wasn't even undergrad, I graduated, I still live in Isla Vista, like college town next to Santa Barbara, and it's like black woman friend of mine, we were talking about like race stuff one time, and I remember her saying, like we talk about privilege all the time and everything, but like white people don't have spiritual privilege like we do. And I thought that was kind of generous of her. I was like, oh, so you guys have like privileges we don't? Like, I never heard that shit in the black studies and stuff and like anthropology classes. And she's like, well, yeah, like we got like culture, we got church, we got good food, we got dancing, we got like music, all this shit. Like we got all this shit, and we look at, sometimes I look at you guys and it's like, you guys just got like stress and like you're just like, gotta work harder than other people, gotta get a bigger house and shit like that. So it kind of reminds me of that, but at the same time, that's still kind of, I don't know, it's still stereotypes. And it may actually be inaccurate. So, the other part of this article that was sort of contradicting itself, in the conclusion, it was saying that one of the issues may just be that we're not doing research well enough. Like, for example, the implicit bias problems in the healthcare sector, it could be that there are overdoses. There could be sort of more hidden kinds of deaths amongst, for example, black women, that coroners and healthcare professionals and stuff actually aren't even calling suicides. Like, they were saying that there may be a higher prevalence of, I am hoping I'm remembering this right, a higher prevalence of quote-unquote accidental deaths among black women that aren't being considered suicide, which could be suicide, maybe in part because of stereotypes that white healthcare professionals will sometimes overlook. Like, there's this thing where a lot of the time, like, white people will think that black men are like stronger and bigger and sort of like invincible, and so they'll overlook complaints having to do with like pain and struggle of any kind. They'll just be like, oh no, you're fine. So maybe that's happening with like black women as well. In any case, it's hard to say. I'm really not going to be persuasive any which way of like why the racial disparities around suicide rates are what they are. I really don't know. I do think that Harriet has touched on this a few times, in that, 50 to 100 years ago, in part because of how racist American society was, a what she always likes to say is like a white male wage was enough to pay for an entire family, like a nuclear family with like a bunch of kids. A single white male, or like a married white male, going off to work and a woman not having a job was enough to pay for everything and like send the kids off to college and all that. So with all these sort of neoliberal reform trends that we've spoken about many times, the decimation of unions, automation, robots, and impoverished human beings throughout the global south taking over manufacturing jobs, the deindustrialization of America, these things could have sort of set off a sort of snowball effect of white men had a certain quality of life that now is just becoming worse and worse and worse over time. That's becoming maybe a little bit more like what maybe non-white males had been experiencing previously, like at least in the economic arena. Maybe maybe that's actually what Tim Wise means when he's like, well, white men are being kicked off the pedestal a little bit and they can't handle it or whatever. So like maybe that's it. In any case, I don't really know. Let listeners decide. Why is it that white men kill themselves a lot more than other people? But I wanted also to talk about a little bit more like the personal, like what the experience is. So I'm going to ask a question and then answer the question. Why do people kill themselves? Why do they think about killing themselves? So I'm going to get a little personal here. I probably mentioned this in a previous episode. I am someone who has thought about suicide. I've thought about killing myself. That's interesting. I've thought about killing myself easily thousands of times in my life, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of times in my life. The concept of suicide doesn't scare me. It doesn't make me uncomfortable. I'm so familiar with it personally. And now, like, clinically, since I'm a therapist, it's like a non-issue to me. Like, it doesn't bring up any discomfort. I can talk about it like as if I'm talking about a sandwich or something. So my own sort of past suicidality, I never attempted, but I was really close, actually. My own past suicidality led me to seeing a therapist in my early mid-20s, which then made me think about becoming a therapist when I was still studying cultural anthropology as an undergrad at UCSB. Because I found what was happening in the process of the therapeutic relationship so enormously helpful for me, that I thought, I want to do this for other people. And it seems like it's an actual like job. It's something that's kind of like dignified, and you can get paid like okay money from doing it. Like at least like you can like live off it type thing. So I want to share a little bit about my own internal experience of having contemplated very seriously suicide. Having like halfway lost my mind like multiple times in a state of like really severe depression, coupled with like, with like really severe anxiety, at some point having sort of quasi panic attacks, like in the mode of thinking about killing myself, as well as, so I'll talk about that, and then I'll speak a little bit on like sort of the clinical part, like what's it like to be on the other side, like somebody who's sort of been suicidal, becomes a therapist years later, and like treats suicidal people like pretty regularly. So why was I suicidal? So when I think back, I think the social connections theory stuff is totally the thing, because when I think back to the first time I think I thought most seriously about killing myself, I was in my late teens, and my first very serious girlfriend cheated on me. And, man, it still brings up a little bit even saying it. Like, it was so painful at the time. And part of why it happened was, like, I was so not emotionally intelligent or present with her ever. Like, I think she was pretty checked out of the relationship after, like, a year. To where, and we both partied a lot. She kind of partied more than I did. She was extremely flirtatious at parties with other guys, and I sort of had to just, like, get used to that. But when she actually did cheat on me with this one guy, I remember, like, I was getting basically blacked out drunk, like, every night. I think every day for that whole time. We were living together. And mind you, so when you talk about, like, social connections, the reason I lived with her was when I turned 18, my mom told me she had put a down payment on a house in Fresno County, in like a pretty poor area of Fresno County, like was it Bakersfield? It's like somewhere around there. And I still had about 6 months left to finish high school. And I think I've mentioned this before, but I grew up in like a pretty poor apartment complex, like Section 8, like subsidized housing, like housing is what we call it sometimes, like living off of housing. So I lived with her like in like housing project, like my whole life, basically. And I didn't know how in the hell she was even able. I was like, you bought a house? What? And she's like, yeah, if you want to come live with me, you can come live with me. And I was like, well, I have to finish high school, And she's like, oh, well, maybe you could switch high schools. Like, I was like, no, I'll just live somewhere else. This is like a really concise summary of what how this went down. But I did actually like couch surf, and then later got like a full guest room in my friend's house while finishing high school. My mom like moved. My dad has been homeless most of my life, but then after finishing high school, he like inherited some money from my grandpa to be able to have a house for a short time that he was renting. So I lived with him for a couple of years, and then they were evicted because he wasn't able to pay the rent anymore. So I was sleeping like in a closet of a motel with him and his girlfriend while I was still with my girlfriend, and I'd just be like I was like crying all the time. I was a wreck, in part because of all these economic factors, but how sort of like broken my family was, in large part because of economic factors, mind you. You may be noticing a theme. Um, but the economic and the sort of social connectivity piece are very, very strongly interlinked. So anyway, my girlfriend's mom was just like, look, this is what they're putting you through is ridiculous. Come live with us. So that's how I ended up living with my girlfriend. So her cheating on me and me feeling like, I'm being like severely abandoned, and I'm having my whole life torn to shreds. It wasn't just that I was being cheated on by her, but it was that like I didn't really feel like I had a family. I mean, I'm 35 and I don't entirely feel that way anymore. And I have like the chosen family thing that like the LGB and the T's like really like to talk about a lot. Like I have that chosen family thing. In any case, suicidality kicked in pretty intensely after I was cheated on, in part because it felt like, the foundation of who I am and the connections that I have are kind of all in this one person. This romantic and sexual partner that I have here, who I live with. Doesn't she love me? Doesn't she want me to be the only one? No. Everything's gone, my whole life. So this extreme kind of binary thinking sets in. This is pretty common. People get cheated on, or if there's any extreme form of loss or rejection. And so, first thought is just like, I should end it. So, the DBT kicks in a little bit, and usually what I tell people when they're suicidal is like, so when that thought passes through your head, like, I should kill myself, I should end my life, like, it's a sort of poetic translation from a different kind of thought that you could probably insert there as well, which is that what I'm experiencing is too painful to experience right now, and I need a way to turn off the pain. And then that goes to killing myself will make sure that I no longer feel this pain anymore. So, I didn't know that back then when I was feeling suicidal. In my like early mid-20s, there were a couple really similar relationships. There's like the getting cheated on thing. There was like partners who were like alcoholics and heroin addicts, and this was just sort of like my type for a while. And we could, maybe if Harriet's ever interested, we could do me as like a whole case study with like my trauma history and stuff that sort of predicts for the kinds of people that you sometimes will attach to and all of that. But in each case where the suicidality thing was very strong in that way, for me, it was, yet again, extreme rejection, real or imagined abandonment. Because usually in those cases, you're not actually being abandoned, but you feel as though you're being abandoned. So feeling like you're being abandoned, the one doesn't see you as the one anymore. And it's almost like, if you throw all your eggs into one basket, meaning if all of your social connectivity is assigned to one individual, and if that one individual does not live up to your expectations for sexual and romantic loyalty and exclusivity, if they are not responding to your text messages as quickly as you want them to, if they are, if they seem to be flirting with someone at a party, and maybe they're not actually flirting with someone at the party, or if they are flirting with someone at the party, this is just a sort of friendly thing they're doing. And it actually has nothing to do with you, and they don't really have any interest in anyone else. There's all kinds of ways to explain why someone isn't attending to your individual emotional needs in any given moment, whether it's in a romantic sexual partnership, a friendship, whatever the relationship might be. But this is really extremely common. So to shift into like, now I'm a therapist, or actually I should say like one more thing on this from the, I've been there perspective. And it's that, when you're in that state of mind, it's so hard to explain this to people that haven't been in this state of mind. It's like trying to explain a drug that someone hasn't used, It's like trying to explain a hallucinogen to someone that's never done like acid or shrooms or whatever. Like, like, how do you explain to someone, like, well, like the colors made sounds, or like when you actually experience it, you're like, okay, now I get it. The state of mind you're in when you are thinking seriously about killing yourself is like it's a pretty unique state of mind. And I have run into, like, I'd say a large part of my sort of social circle these days are people who are a little bit more on the, what I'd say, like the normie side, like people who, and that's a pretty false category. There really is no such thing, but people who've never thought about suicide, people who've never like used hard drugs, people that don't like have the kind of like personal history that I do. Most people I know like did not grow up in the relative poverty that I grew up in. Most people I know are in very kind of like middle class and whatever now, because I sort of did a class mobility thing, like upward from where I came from. So that's sort of the social class I tend to socialize in now. But that state of mind is, I guess to describe it to people, I'll use like some metaphors. So if you think of so the term black hole kind of comes to mind. Where like everything is getting sucked into this whole, this like all everything in your experience is being sucked into this abyss of despair that is so hard to describe. Like it's pain. I've been pepper sprayed before. I have gout, which is like one of the most extremely painful arthritis conditions you can have. Like, I've experienced a lot of really severe physical pain in my life. I would say the emotional anguish that you're in when you are in a very sort of active suicidal ideation state of mind is far worse than any physical pain I've ever experienced. And anyone I've spoken to, I think, would agree as well. That they'd much prefer physical pain over this kind of emotional pain. Because the other thing is, like, I think the fact that people who haven't felt suicidal don't understand it kind of speaks to how outlandish it is. And so maybe another mini DBT lecture. In DBT we talk a shit ton about the importance of emotional validation. And Alan Fruzzetti, who's like probably the number one nerd behind DBT right now, there's a good YouTube lecture he has. Feel free to look him up. Alan Fruzzetti Validation, just to watch his lecture. There's a lot of research now into the neurobiological, nervous system, emotion system that emotional validation plays. So if you are having a hard time and I'm just nodding my head and listening, that's providing some level of basic validation, which in turn regulates, it modifies your nervous system and your brain chemistry and most of the most important parts of your internal physiology are modified by me nodding my head calmly and going, mm-hmm. Or even better yet, like, wow, it sounds like you had a really hard day, or wow, I can't believe they said that to you. So these validating responses serve as an emotional, they calm you down is a simple way to put it. But the reason this is sort of important is like in like a sciencey, almost like physiological sense, is that if you've ever been in a state where like you feel really misunderstood, someone is being invalidating to you in some way, and you just feel so upset and you're just like, you're uncomfortable in your own body. When you're in a state of actually contemplating suicide, you no longer view yourself as valid. Like your perception, your emotion, like nothing within your being is valid. So you're self-invalidating to the extent that you are trying to strategize on how to murder yourself. So like, again, it's hard to explain to other people, but you no longer see yourself as being connected to anything. Like, you don't have a connection to yourself, you don't have a connection to your community, to your family, You don't have a connection to like God or a higher purpose or higher power. You are connectionless. You're just sort of like drifting away, and you don't matter to anyone or anything, and there's no purpose, and there's no way out, and there's no way back, and there's no reason to look for a way back to joy or happiness or connection, because and this is sort of the logic, right, of the sort of the depression mind, the suicide mind. The only thing that makes sense is, you have to die. Like you have to figure out a way to die. So imagine like you've fallen down that, like into that black hole so far that now you're actually moving from the self-invalidation thoughts, like I don't matter, no one cares, and all that kind of stuff, to because those are the sort of the conditions. That state of mind is maybe like the kindling for the actual planning, or the, like, so you're romanticizing, you're idealizing the actual, just the concept of death. And some people sometimes are just like, fuck my life, everything sucks, I want to die. And that's just like a lot different. That's just like you're stressed, or it's like a fleeting thought. Or I mean, even for some people, like it'll be like I hate to say this, but for some people there is an element of sort of attention seeking on social media, or something like that. And it's messed up to say like, oh well, it's just a cry for help. It's like, well, yeah, like, it's good if it's a cry for help. I mean, someone's actually asking for help. But it's different to, like, once you're down into this black hole and suddenly you're like, well, I mean, and these are thoughts that have passed through my head. So like, I'm very familiar with this. Like, well, okay, well, like a blade would really hurt. Like that would really hurt. Well, like how bad would it hurt? And you're like bargaining with yourself. Well, okay. Or maybe not a blade. Okay, well, I'll go back to that later, right? And you're like thinking, and you think this is like reasonable. And you're like, okay, well, Virginia Woolf did like the rocks in her dress thing. What about, there's drowning? I go, oh, that'd be horrible. Why wouldn't want to get eaten by a shark on my way down there? You're like actually thinking these thoughts. Well, like, oh, a train. Okay, well, a train would be like, so, or like, oh, well, like, oh, there's that really high building. If you get to the top of it, then you could like, so, in like my late 20s, I actually ran into, like, before I ended up going to grad school, I ran into like another rough situation that kind of led me down through the black hole. I ended up writing like this little book of poetry. I used to be much more creative than I am now, but I wrote a whole book of poetry about suicide to kind of let this out, and I shared it with like a really select few group of friends to just kind of let them know, like, this is actually what I go through sometimes. Like, this is what I went through a few months ago. And it was sort of like the inner voice of it was my sort of suicide voice. It was like the logic of it. And I tried to break it down as much as I could. I think like maybe one or two friends were like, wow, this is amazing that you shared this with me. Others were just like really uncomfortable with it. Didn't really know what to do, understandably. But like, so once your mind goes to that point, this is sort of where you're on the edge, right? Like, this is what we call in the mental health field, like suicidal ideation. Some might call it like a fantasy, but it's no longer like you're in a bad mood, or like you don't like yourself, or you're really critical of yourself. You're like, actual suicide is a kind of good idea. Then you go to the next step of like, here's how I might kill myself. So, and then there's a sort of step between like ideation and planning, where ideation is when and then there's sort of, they blend together, but planning would be like, okay, I'm going to like give away all my stuff. And so like, I never did this. I never got this far personally. I got really, really close, but you'd be like, okay, I'm going to write a will. I'm going to write like a letter to people, like all of that. Like, you're actually planning out, like, Saturday night, I'm going to go to the place and I'm going to do the thing. But before that, I need to like give away my possessions and write letters to people and everything. something Harriet and I think, are trying to drive the damn point home that everything I just described as a personal experience cannot be removed from the larger context in which we have experiences. In other words, even in the case where you're like, my wife is divorcing me, my girlfriend cheated on me, like whatever your sort of interpersonal thing is, like everything interpersonal is happening within like a social and cultural and political and economic context. There isn't an interpersonal that is removed from all of those things. So like I was saying, in my late teens, the context of my extreme disconnection from my girlfriend who cheated on me also was that my mom basically left me to go live in a house that she bought while I had to couch surf to finish high school. And then I lived with my dad, who'd been basically absent for most of my life. And we were evicted, right? So evictions, like that should be on everybody's mind right now. Like we were evicted because he couldn't pay rent. And then I slept in a closet in a motel where his girlfriend was actually paying because she had like 2 part-time jobs at like a bagel shop and like a coffee shop or something. And like my dad just like didn't work, which is like a whole story in and of itself of like why he never like really worked. So there were economics, and my parents' histories are in a political and economic and social history. Like I could probably spend like 5 hours on like my life as a case study that gets into all these things, as we could spend on any individual who could maybe come on the podcast. We could do it with Harriet, but all of our lives are like interconnected to all these things. So, I hope Harriet and I never like minimize the personal and the emotional. I think we just feel that the emphasis is a bit myopic by the mental health field. So in any case, so from that clinical perspective, the suicidal clients I've had in my short career compared to Harriet's has been, I would say, in 100% of cases of suicidal people I'd seen, the sort of disconnection issue is the simplest way of describing the cause of their suicidality. Thinking of this one guy, teen guy, lots of domestic violence and substance abuse in the family, dumped by his girlfriend, everybody thinking he's an outcast at school, scars all over his body, moving further and further into like this sort of outcast identity because no one would accept him, feeling constantly rejected by his parents. Suddenly, social workers and like police are entering into his life and sort of giving him this sort of attention that actually seems more punitive than nurturing. And he just kept like going further and further down this just like this isolative, like no one understands me kind of perception. Adult, like the parents I'd worked, cause I worked mainly with like kids, but then like families and parents like through the kids, for the last 5 years. I mean, the parents who'd struggled with suicidality, really a similar thing. I mean, moms who like, domestic violence, the dad's not around, or the dad's trying to get around, the dad is like batshit crazy and inconsistent, and the mom has the entire sort of financial burden of taking care of the kids and herself, had to drop out of school. So like disconnection from the dad, disconnection from the kids are pissed at her because they can't have all the toys that they want. She's feeling rejected from them. Parents often shaming the mom because they're like, well, why did you choose that piece of shit guy? So just like increasing isolation, invalidation, disconnection, like really not feeling understood or valued by people in their lives. And I could just kind of keep going down the list. I could keep thinking of all the clients that I've had who have, when they've moved toward the ideation or even suicide attempts, I mean, the ones that had like actual suicide attempts, I've not had a client who's actually killed themselves yet, but or I mean, it's not like it's inevitable, but I have not had one. Um, I'd say, yeah, in every case, there's something like this. There's like rejection or abandonment or betrayal, like a really severe, severance of connection that happens. And usually, like a bunch of those severings that happen over the course of a lifetime. So there is my solo episode on suicide. It's a bit depressing, but hey guys, suicide happens. It happens all the time. Something I'm pretty worried about right now in California, the Judicial Council. I think it was 3 judges, maybe it's more, but they got the votes to lift the ban on evictions in California. So I think Governor Newsom can do something to. I think he can like he can put the moratorium or ban back in place somehow. I think. I'm not a total expert on like this whole process, but if Newsom does nothing, then as of September 1st, we're gonna see evictions kind of skyrocketing in California, and I think this is already happening in other states. But I don't think that evictions are going to cause suicide, but I think the level of severity of economic insecurity that's happening for everybody right now is likely to, be correlated with higher rates of suicide, which is, really sad. I really want to iterate to people again, like, for everybody listening, like, Jesus, I don't know how else to say it. One of the most frustrating things for like the 3 years I tried to unionize my workplace was that like people they're like too scared. They're like, no, I can't get involved in that. I'm not that kind of person. I really want listeners to like, in the same way that I would want someone that's being suicidal to stop thinking the thoughts that you are worthless and no one cares and it doesn't matter if you kill yourself and everything's going to get better. Like, just cut it out, right? If I could sort of press a button, I'd get those thoughts to go away. Similarly, anyone listening, if you have thoughts like, oh, well, I'm not really the kind of person to like join a political organization or like form a union or, get involved in like activist stuff. Like, I think all of humanity really needs for you to cut that shit out because it's just not true. It's not true and it's not helpful. So I really want listeners to think about this. Like, what's my role in this shit, right? Not in suicide, like not what's my role, like how do I prevent suicides? How do I like be nicer to people? Yeah, be nicer to people, sure. Think beyond the personal and the interpersonal if you can. If you are suicidal, I would prefer that you stick around for the revolution in like all seriousness. A better world very much is possible, and it really is sort of right around the corner. It just depends on how many people we can recruit into like really effective mass-based political organizing, which means we need like everybody on deck, like sacrificing a little bit of whatever they do in their leisure time, assuming they have a little bit of leisure time, toward organizing. So if you're suicidal right now, consider like, we absolutely fucking need you right now. All right, so this is just me talking to myself in a car. Peace out, everybody. If you want to contact us, email us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. If you're listening on an iPhone, please give us a 5-star. It games the algorithms a little bit on Apple. And consider becoming one of our patrons. Patreon.com/itsnotjustinyourhead.